you're welcome to to the reframe. Um, yeah, so I've known both Celine and Cynthia for a while. Celine, I think I remember meeting you in 2007 or 8 or something like that at a Simon's thing. So it's been a long, long time. And both of them have very long and storied and accomplished careers as autism researchers, clinicians, ADOS people, trainers. So it's like they've been around and are incredibly well respected. So I just thought it was really cool. I think Celine did it first in Atlanta, and now Cynthia's done it more recently, where they made this shift to private practice. And let's be real here. Like, how many of us have not considered that at some time in our career? I love academia. I do. I love research. I love, working with patients the way that I do with this kind of support system. But we've all toyed with this idea. So when Cynthia jumped ship to use Celine, and I know Celine is enjoying her life right now, I thought, you know what might be good for our community is to learn from the experts on, and again, I bet it's not all roses because having owned my own businesses too, I know that there's a lot of stress that can be associated with it. So I thought, like, hey, let's hear from them. What are the opportunities? How do they do it? What are the possibilities, the strengths associated with it, and also like when we all eventually jump ship, we can use them as our mentors, and we can call them and find out what we're doing wrong. So that being said, welcome guys. I'm so glad that you guys can both come and give this presentation. You have about 50 minutes, and then there might be time for questions. I hope there are. But I'll turn my camera off, and believe me, I'm taking notes on this one, like taking notes totally. So, all right, all yours.
Thanks, Steve. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Steve, so much for the invite for this. And oh, this is such a wonderful, wonderful group. And we're not, and Selena and I did not rehearse this, so we're going to be kind of passing it back and forth. But and we can have like open dialogue as well. So I think in general, taking the leap, it's not really like a academia private practice, but it's more of different ways of providing access to the community on evidence-based intervention and how to kind of grow and serve in our roles in a variety of different ways, also as just life progresses and demands and things in life get more challenging as we get older, because I think probably most of us here are from the late 1900s, so we're all unfortunately getting older. Oh, here we go. So we'll start with our paths of how we got here. So I'll tell my story, then we'll switch over to Selene, and then we'll kind of be going back and forth throughout this presentation. So I've come into the field always as a clinician who has worked in both clinical and in research settings. So when I think back about, it was over 20 years ago now, I was working in a child development lab doing a lot of attachment research, qualitative interviews with parents, adult attachment interviews, qualitative coding with children, and neuropsychological assessments of looking at attachment patterns on emotional competence and emotional regulation, and how those can potentially mediate mental health conditions. Simultaneously, I was working, so this was in rural Appalachia, and I was also working in a community mental health center. And I was under the supervision at that time of a psychiatric nurse practitioner. And I just noticed this huge gap between all of this knowledge that we had in this research lab, and then how, quite honestly, at the time, poor mental health services we had for these very at-risk and vulnerable kids in rural Appalachia. And so I had asked the question to my to the PI, and I said, well, what are we going to do with all this research? Like, I'm going to the community mental health center less than a mile away, and like this knowledge isn't there. And when I got the answer of like, well, we're going to write a paper, and I was like, okay, so then like, what does the paper do? Does that then build the program? I'm like, well, no, it's going to go in a journal, and then, maybe someone will read it, and then maybe that'll translate into a program being built, and then maybe eventually it'll make it into this community mental health center. And so that at that time resonated with me as wanting to be that bridge in between those things. So how can we take what we are learning, what we have in these like rich academic medical centers and provide them in a frontline clinical approach for children and their families. And so that hit me really early on. And I knew I wanted to go that route. I knew I wanted to be a very research, academic informed clinician. Um, I did not expect myself to go from rural Appalachia to the middle of New York City, but here I am. I am now in the middle and have been for quite some time now in the middle of busy Manhattan, New York City. But I always, so that path was a little unexpected. But what was always expected for me is this like research informed clinician. So I did a lot of my early work in very academic settings. I worked with Dr. Catherine Lord. I worked in Boston Children's Hospital under the Harvard Medical System in research phenotyping, in neurodevelopmental and neuropsychological assessment, and just doing a variety of research informed phenotyping and assessment work, and just really loved it. I moved on into being in leadership positions, starting and running phenotyping programs, autism centers, and I've always loved gold standard assessment. So, from working with Kathy and being an ADOS trainer and an ADI trainer, knowing how to use those tools really to their maximum capacity to not just answer a diagnostic question, but to really understand complex variable presentations of kids with autism and neurodevelopmental differences, and to be able to follow them over time and really like change their trajectory. I really believe as researchers and as clinicians, we really can change the trajectory of children, and help them really reach their best. I just loved that work and found that there's a big gap. There's a lot of us in academia. When I was working at Weill Cornell, or when I was working at Boston Children's Hospital, I found that we have all of this knowledge and we make all of these recommendations, but how translatable is that? Who do we refer these families to? And that's where I always found that there was a challenge in doing that. We would make all of these recommendations, but actually connecting families with providers who could help them gain those skills and access those interventions was much harder. So I had a bit of a step down. I would say when you're thinking about making that jump from academia into private practice, you really have to be ready for it. At various points in my career, I definitely was not ready. I very much wanted to stay in more of the academic medical setting. And then when I had moved from Boston back to New York City and had moved more into an independent organization where it was a little bit more of a bridge between academia and private practice, was when I started to develop more of the interest in really being able to be at the forefront of the clinical work. And when you're working for a big company, as everybody I'm sure experiences, there's always a lot of bureaucracy at the top. You start to have less and less autonomy over things. So after a number of changes and kind of getting in the last 5 minutes of a meeting, like, oh, here's a whole bunch of changes coming up in leadership structure and restructuring and how it's going to impact your position, that was when I thought, you know what, I think now I'm ready to make the jump. So I think when people are thinking about when you're ready or not ready, you really want to be at that point where you're like, yes, I'm ready. I'm kind of done with this part. I've gained all I need to gain there. And now I really have this desire for autonomy and for flexibility. So I moved into private practice last May, and I've been doing solo private practice I was doing it for about 4 or 5 months when the demand was just so high, and I was getting so many inquiries from other families with places where I couldn't refer them to, as well as from clinicians who wanted to join my practice, that I've now started building out a more boutique style group neurodevelopmental practice in the middle of Manhattan. So I started in rural Appalachia, and now I'm in the middle of a very busy city, which is quite fun. So now I'll pass it over to Celine for her story.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much, Cynthia. And I love everything that you said and wish I could be like, yes, that's exactly why I went into private practice. It's so honorable, but my trajectory is very different. I coincidentally last week, my daughter, who's a freshman in college, had to write a paper for a woman warrior class on a woman warrior. And she had to do an interview because it was a biography, and she chose me to talk about this exact topic. And I'm like, oh my God, how it's perfect timing, because I'm going to give a talk on this, so it'll help me prep. By the end of the interview, I was sobbing, and I didn't realize that it was 8 years ago, the reliving the trauma and the anguish of making that transition, but also surprisingly, like tears of joy. The fact that had I not transitioned to what I'm doing now, she never would have written that about me. She would have written it about somebody else. And it's just kind of such a testament to everything that we're going to be talking about here. Because the beginning of my career, the first decade of my career, I was walking on water, loved everything that I was doing. I mean, like Cynthia, surrounded by these phenomenal mentors. I had Ami Klin and Fred Volkmar and Kasia Havarska and Sarah Sparrow. And it really didn't, and I was doing all the clinical work within a research environment. And then when it came time to transition to Emory and deciding, like, do I want to make even that transition? I didn't want to leave Yale. I loved everyone I worked with. I loved my job, but it was a new opportunity. And it was a realization at that point that almost 10 years into my career, I had stayed lateral. I wasn't even an assistant professor. And my colleagues, my friends, even my husband, who graduated a year after me, they were tenured professors. And even people that I trained had like surpassed me in academic rank. So when I get to Emory, I'm starting out as a quote unquote junior faculty, but I wasn't at the beginning of my career. So I think that's when it probably started, the kind of ambiguity of what my role was. And fast forward 7 years of that. Again, parts of what I did, absolutely loved. Everyone I worked with, absolutely loved. It just became too much for me. I was working nonstop. So many of you, I'm preaching to the choir. I dropped my kids off at 7 a.m., picked them up at 7 p.m. When I got to the dinner table, my laptop's open. Weekends, vacations, same thing. You're never not working. And even though I was academically junior from a faculty standpoint, I was in leadership positions and training a whole bunch of staff. So now I'm farther removed from the clinical work that I loved and more supervising everyone doing that work and herding cats and putting out fires. And the more you get into leadership positions, again, preaching to the choir, that, it can be lonely and it can be challenging, and you're dealing with a lot of grievances rather than, successes and celebrations. And so it just got to the point where I needed a change for my own quality of life. But having done a relocation once, for those of you who've ever had to do a spousal hire, I would not wish that on my worst enemy. So I was not about to do that again. My husband was a very established tenured professor, chair of a multidisciplinary department. My kids were in middle school at this point. I'm not, going to pluck them into a new life. So if I wasn't going to relocate, my only option really was to go into private practice. I never, ever wanted to. And in fact, my husband used to be like, you'll make more money, you'll be happier. I'd be like, no, I have no interest. And so that was really scary for me. And Steve, we're joking about my using the phrase jumping ship, but at the time, this is 2018, I had several colleagues tell me that I was committing career suicide. So to me, it was like jumping into an abyss. Um, and I had always done kind of like Cynthia was talking about. I was always doing consulting, teaching and training. I had the Vineland stuff that I was doing that was kind of on the side. So I knew that I could continue doing that, but that wasn't gonna, round out everything. So I had to open a practice. So it was nerve wracking. I don't have a business bone in my body. I didn't hire anybody. I have a beautiful space that my daughter's pediatrician like almost gave to me, which I still have. And I just was very fortunate. but literally having to meet people in the community and build that reputation up from the ground, because there really isn't so much connection between academia and clinical practice. When we think about it, when we're in the ivory tower, we're like, oh, we're doing, implementation science and all this kind of stuff and going out in the community. But the people in the community doing this work day in, day out have very little connection to the academic world. And so, fast forwarding to now, I think on day one, when I had my first client, it was just exhaling of, wow, I miss this so much. Like being connected to these families, being in that assessment process of like, putting the puzzles together and helping families directly, and then connecting with my community practitioners. This has been phenomenal for me. Um, then, not to mention the quality of life. Um, Steve, another thing that you joked about is making more money. I'm like, if I worked as much as I used to work, then I would absolutely be killing it. But when I looked at my finances for 2025, I'm like, why am I making less than what I made at Emory 8 years ago? And then realized I took 12 weeks vacation this year. Every week that one of my daughters has off from school. So tomorrow night, my daughter flies home from California. I have all next week off. Last week I took off because it was February vacation for my other daughter. So we went to on vacation. I just don't work when I don't need to work, and it's fabulous. And so that quality of life is unbelievably different. And to be able to just say I love what I do, I don't have to do any work that I don't want to do. If something like a review came in today and I'm like, oh my God, this looks really interesting, yes, I'll do that review. But last week one came in and I was on vacation. Like, no, I'm not going to do that review. If I go to grant meetings, if I go to conferences, when I go to INSAR, that's because I want to go, not because I have to go. And as arbitrary as that seems, it's just such a difference in my life. I should say that I needed that difference in my quality of life and that work-life balance. So that's kind of what my trajectory has been. And so there's a lot of overlap, and Cynthia and I will talk about the many different things that we do. But, just for those of you who might be in a similar position, it's scary, but it's liberating at the same time. And in retrospect, I'm like, oh, why didn't I do this sooner? I definitely wouldn't have done it straight out of grad school, but absolutely was the right decision for me. So there you go.
Nice. Yeah, I have to echo that quality of life. It's incredible how you don't even realize until you've shifted of like, wow, the like amount of time, the flexibility. Yeah, I would echo that that's pretty remarkable. Um, so that kind of separating out some of the benefits of private practice. So for people who are thinking about, okay, so what are some of the pros and cons of private practice as compared to being in an academic university-based position, there's benefits that are both for the clinician as well as for the field. So as Selene was describing, and as I would absolutely echo, you have so much autonomy. And the idea of that, you are in control of your schedule. You're in control of your clinical decision making. There's nobody who you have to answer to. You're your own boss. You get to choose what you want to do, how you're doing it, what direction you want to go. You also have a lot of financial transparency, which I think is really nice. So you really get to manage your own overhead. You get to manage how resources are allocated, and you can really develop a niche very deeply. So you get to really decide what is your clinical expertise, what do you love doing, what value do you bring in that clinical front, and really focus on that. And then there's a lot of geographical freedom. So I've been doing some work that I was always interested in doing before, but it was always like, oh, it would be so hard to make this work or how to do that. And when you're in private practice, when you're running your own business, you get to really decide what do you want to do and how do you want to do it. So I want to go and do a consultation, have a request for an international consultation in Singapore. Why not? Let's go to Singapore. Oh, now there's an advisory committee meeting in India and then maybe a stopover in Dubai. Why not? So you really get to think about, is it interesting to you? Do you want to do it? Is it meaningful? And you go for it, which is really cool. And then I find that there's a lot of benefit also for the field. So like Celine was saying, we would sit up in our ivory tower and we're so disconnected from what's actually happening in the community. And so bringing down that ivory tower or taking some of us out of the ivory tower and putting us into the community is huge, because you can go exactly from dissemination of evidence-based intervention to providing the evidence-based intervention. You don't have to translate it for community-based provider. You are now the community-based provider. So it provides accessibility in a way that I have found to be really powerful, and in a way where I will have to say I was pretty shocked to see what the demand is. Because when I started, I was like, I don't know, will people, like there's some people, sure, like in my current caseload who know me, and of course there's reason why they want to stay continuity of care, but like, how will other people find me? In 2 weeks, my inbox was full, my phone was full. I never advertised anything. So, and it stayed that way. So I would say that once you go from being somebody who has this very strong academic research oriented background and now you're providing it in the community, people find out about it pretty quickly and just through word of mouth find you. I also think for our field, we really do need to do a better job at bridging the research, the gap between what's happening, what are our findings in the research, and how applicable are they into the real world, and being able to actually feed that back into that loop. I think there's huge value in that, and by having more of us sprinkled out in more frontline community settings, we're able to do that. You're also able to develop a specialized care model. So I'm working on building out of a more group practice model now, where you're able to pick, okay, what type of care do you want to provide and how can you do that? What disciplines are needed to do that? And then you can provide innovation without having as many constraints as in a larger institutional environment, where you're of course going to have various layers of bureaucracy embedded in them. And then let's see, am I passing this one to you, Celine? I think so.
Sure. Yeah, and I think, Cynthia, we probably do some overlap of similar things, but some different, because I, in my clinical practice, just do diagnostic testing, specializing in autism being the referral. And I don't do therapy or treatment. When I started out, I was so nervous that, just like you said, that I might not have enough clients. That's why I named my company Neurodevelopmental Assessment and Consulting Services, which is a mouthful. My brother joked if I just put Saulnier in front of it, my acronym could be SNACS instead of NACS. But I was like, I need to be broad, but now I am so specialized, just like you were saying about the boutique clinic, that I just farm out psychoed. I farm out if it's like an ADHD or learning disability and not autism being the primary. Obviously, I'm going to also assess for those things if it comes my way, but I don't even own academic achievement testing. So now I have partnerships in the community where I can, on speed dial, have a clinician saying, can you do the dyslexia testing for one of my clients? And vice versa. They call me up, like, can you do the autism add-ons for this kid that I'm testing? But in addition to that, on the consulting side, I've consulted on grants, which is so much easier and a lot less red tape for the institution when you're a contractor than when you have overhead, right? They just pay you a flat fee. They don't have to do the fringe and the indirects. And then I have done a whole bunch of stuff for the Vineland, clinical trials use the Vineland. Now ABA companies use the Vineland, so training on that and consulting and helping to analyze data. And then I do a lot of teaching and training. I did continue to teach a course at Emory for a while. Now Cheryl Clayman's teaching that course, which is awesome. And then I travel a lot to do continuing ed training. So I train a lot of community practitioners on autism assessments and treatment and intervention. So I do that, and then forensic evaluations. Ami Klin got me into this, where he would bring me into assessments. A lot of the child porn, the older adolescents and adults on the spectrum who get kind of caught up in child pornography. It's a huge sub area. If you don't know about it, it's unfortunately all too common, where obviously our clients are not pedophiles. They get either manipulated or fixated or just into child porn from adult porn. It's a whole different discussion. But I do a lot of going into federal detention centers and doing assessments to determine if individuals have autism or not. And a lot of those are child porn. And consulting in the community. So I have a few, and this is actually international. I have someone in Norway, in Denmark, I'm sorry, who I'm training on assessments. They're newly coming into autism assessments. They're very accomplished clinicians in their own right, but they want the consultation to help on their autism specific cases. So I kind of piece all of that together. And what's so nice is that I can schedule everything accordingly, right? So I only see 1 to 2 clients a week, maybe, and I'm already scheduled out to June. And so if I don't want someone to wait that long, I'm helping connect them and referring to someone else in the community, because my consulting might be too demanding right now for me to take on additional work. And it's that flexible, right? Or I can say, I want to have this summer off. So I'm going to take the whole month off, and I'm going to push all of this out or refer it out. And it's nice to have that flexibility.
There.
Cynthia, do you want to talk about the clinical work? Because you do treatment, right?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So I also do the treatment side. So for a long time, kind of in different, I initially started in neuropsychology, and then I actually didn't have autism on my radar. I was going to be a pediatric neuropsychologist. My dissertation was in looking at electrophysiology of ADHD and looking at, there were different drug challenge studies that I was on. And then when I did my therapy practicum, I had that year where I was doing my therapy practicum, they had merged the ADHD and autism programs. And so one of the little girls on my caseload was a 3-year-old minimally verbal or non-verbal child with autism. And I was working with her on improving her communication. So we were working on the PEC system. And I loved treatment so much, because to be able to help a very young child learn how to communicate was so rewarding. And then from there, I had started asking people like, well, is there some kind of like neuropsychology with kids with autism where you also do therapy? And then from there kind of found my way into the autism world, and that was where I was working with Dr. Valeria Nanclares, who was one of the Spanish trainers in the ADOS and ADI, and had connected me with Kathy. And then I went out and worked one summer with Kathy and was just like hooked, and was like, oh my gosh, we need this like merge where we merge neuropsychology and autism testing. And then I did predominantly testing for quite some time, but then started to notice like we would make all these recommendations of what type of intervention the kids needed, but it was so hard to find clinicians who really knew how to work with an autistic child, even a child who had a very high IQ, but really asynchronous development within there. And there were so many co-occurring mental health issues and just like general mood dysregulation difficulties that then I was like, well, I need to start doing treatment. And so I started then branching into that as well. So I've kind of just grown over the course of my career to seeing that there's really a lot of value in doing all of it, and it's all really interrelated to one another. And so that's also what I really liked about this building and development within more of a private practice model, because you're able to then build that yourself. So I'm building around in my practice, it's everything from assessment, diagnostic or neuropsychological assessment, to also the intervention, individual, parent mediated, group, and really being able to provide that 360 type of support and care, and to be able to see the child and family longitudinally, because we know that with neurodevelopmental disorders, for most young kids who we diagnose, they're going to retain those diagnoses, and it's going to impact them to some degree across their lifespan. So way back when I started with Kathy at CADV, when CADV was first opening, I was the early childhood clinician. And I always thought I'm an early childhood diagnostician. Like that was like my focus. But those kids kept getting older, and those kids had more needs. So I think about the kids who I saw on the first word study, and in when CADV, the clinical part had just opened, those toddlers, I still see them. And so now fast forward, they're in high school, or some of them are going off to college. And I even like text Kathy crying the other day about one of the girls who got she got an 800 on her math SAT, and then she got accepted into MIT and Harvard, and she's going into aerospace for things. So it's like having these long relationships with these families and seeing how you can really make and create this change for them is just so rewarding. And I've really wanted to wrap my career around doing everything I can to really help in that area and help training others. So I would say that the move to private practice, you also are able to very much stay invested in training and dissemination of information. So as an ADOS and ADI trainer, I still run lots of ADOS and ADI trainings. I also take externs, I take postdocs, I do professional trainings for other community-based therapists and schools. And so you're able to really continue and also show where you have this model of what you're developing. So I really like that part. And so when I think about the difference in more of a private practice as compared to academia, is that you have a lot of focus on that direct service delivery. Your feedback loops are much shorter. Like if something's not working, or you realize, oh, this isn't great, you can kind of jump in and intervene and make the changes fairly quickly. You certainly have these longitudinal relationships that you form with families, and you're really able to integrate research grade tools in a way that really works. So in my practice, for instance, I will have to say I am not in network with insurance, because insurance, I feel like I paid my dues of having to sit on peer-to-peer calls with value options and fight over RVUs and like all of those things. And the reality is they're just not going to pay for the comprehensive nature that's needed. So you have to find different funding sources to help families who are also not able to afford all of the out-of-pocket fees. But so anyways, separate from that, you're able to stay very focused on what is going to be the best, most comprehensive tools available. And you know what, if I want to do the ADI, I do the ADI, and I can get insurance companies to reimburse families out of network provider for that time that it takes to do the ADI as part of a longer battery of assessments, much easier than I can if I were in network and trying to fight with somebody over a peer-to-peer who's saying like, absolutely not, you're going to get, for 90791, you're going to get this reimbursement whether you spend 30 minutes or you spend 3 hours. So of course, when you're working within that model, no organization is going to let you spend 3 hours for something that's going to get the same reimbursement as if it were 30 minutes. So, some of those things are things that in private practice, you're able to navigate in a different way, which has been really rewarding. So I think I'll go into this one.
I should say that
Oh, go ahead.
that I also don't take insurance, only because I never was involved in insurance in academia. So to me, it was like learning a foreign language. And I don't even have an admin. I don't have any staff. So it's just, like you said, too much to take on. And because I don't do treatment where the reimbursement rate is better, it would be like cost prohibitive when I'm only doing assessments to take insurance.
Yeah. And that's something I think you have to really look at your overhead and operating expenses too, because the cost of getting paneled and then managing third party payers and waiting the cash flow with reimbursements, it's really challenging, and they just don't reimburse for the amount of time that it takes for the work that we do. So and there are ways of helping families to fund that, and manage it in a way that doesn't compromise the clinical care. So it may be a kind of a talk for another day, but there are things like network gap exemptions, for instance, that you can help families set up, where families who I've been working with have been able to get 90, depending on what their in-network benefits are, 90 to 100% reimbursement of the full fee that I charge for the services. So when
Oh,
you
someone
are,
someone just asked, someone just asked a question that's a really good one, Cynthia, about the startup costs.
oh yeah,
And I think you and I, being already established in our careers, it's easier than for those of you who are thinking straight out of grad school. Would be a much different story. But just personally saying, I could borrow from my own family savings, right? And at least 20,000, if not more, to start up my clinic and get everything running. But I reimbursed that within a year of being in practice.
yeah, and I would say I was working in, because I was with an organization where I had a caseload already. I was part of a medical practice within a larger independent organization. And so I had a caseload that wanted to follow me. So I really didn't have any startup costs. I needed to buy a computer. I started subletting I'm in New York, where to get a commercial lease, that's a very long process. So I had just pretty quickly started subletting from from some colleagues who I had worked with at Weill Cornell, who had already moved into private practice. So I was just subletting office space from them and picking a couple days to go up in office, otherwise doing remote, and the startup costs were very low to minimal. I think I got a business credit card to and I put on the business credit card the computer. I bought a computer for the practice and then reimbursed myself for that within the first month. But the general, in terms of the business forming structure. So you do have to think about if you want to set up just a sole proprietorship, which is really no cost. When you're setting up a sole proprietorship, you're just working on your own individual license. So you do have high self-employment taxes with that, though. So that's something to be aware of. And then you do have all of the liability as your individual person. There are costs associated if you set up an LLC or a PLLC, and depending on the state you're in, it's going to vary if you need to do an LLC or a PLLC. If you're in a state where you just need an LLC, my understanding from some colleagues who are also in private practice is that it's pretty simple. You can do it online, you get it pretty quickly. I think it might only even be like a couple $100s to do. If you're in a state like New York State, there are more layers of bureaucracy to it and more steps. So I did hire an attorney for that, and that took I applied for that in June and it came through in October. So that took some time, and that was about $2,500 to $3,000, something along those lines. But what that does is that provides you a liability structure so that you have a company. So then if there's something like malpractice or somebody sues you, they're suing your company instead of you personally, which of course none of us are going into this wanting to be sued. But those are like things, just like when you're working for an organization, you keep your liability insurance and things of that nature. So when you're setting up a private practice for yourself, you also want to think about what level of risk you want to take on, and if you want the risk to be subsumed under a company or under yourself personally. So the other thing is, if you do plan to build into more of a company or a group practice as you go, having a PLLC can make it a little bit easier to do that. You do have different ways of deciding how you're taxed also when you set up a PLLC. So this is going to vary based on the state you're in and also your individual tax situation. But once you've established a PLLC, you can decide to tax your business as an S corp. What you do when you make that tax election, and it's just a piece of paper that you file with the IRS, and then you are approved to be taxed as an S corp after you have your LLC or your PLLC already established. When you do that, you just have to set up payroll for yourself. So you set up payroll, you create a salary for yourself, and then you pay yourself through payroll. And then anything in addition that you make beyond your payroll is you pay yourself in profit distributions from your practice. And that's something that you can do as a solo person. It's also something that you can do if you expand into a group practice. There is a little bit more administrative complexity, but in general, you have pretty significant tax savings if your practice brings in a significant amount of revenue in upwards of 6+ figures. If you're in that range, then you would most likely want to be looking at an S Corp tax election. All right, now pass it to Celine for consulting.
Yeah, so kind of touched upon this already. Consulting could be anything you want it to be. And I had been doing so much of this even throughout my academic career that this was seamless for me to kind of transition and keep doing it. So like I said, with the Vineland, I do a lot of trainings. I do a lot of consulting on grants. Then I also do the teaching and training. I have gone in for things like going to IEP meetings, giving talks for a school system, trainings for a school system. As the school districts learn more and more about me and what I do, those opportunities increase. And again, like you can go out and you can advertise for this. I have colleagues that will literally go set up meetings with the school districts specifically for that purpose, or set up meetings with pediatricians' offices. I just have never had to do that, knock on wood. I think because I blend so much consulting with my clinical work. And this ebbs and flows. There are some times when most of what I'm doing in a month is consulting versus clinical work, or vice versa. And that just depends on what comes and goes. Maybe in the summer months you're flooded with certain things, to get the kids back to school. People want assessments, but then there are times when that trails off, and you kind of get to know that in your area. I think every community is a little different there. And then the teaching and training. So I know if there's ever, if I wanted to pick up more work, I can always go out and, adjunct somewhere, or, the flexibility with that. And keeping an adjunct faculty position, I find so helpful. First and foremost, it keeps you connected to the library, so you have access to all the journal articles that all of my colleagues are publishing. And not to mention the ability to teach through the university. And then it also facilitates, if I were, for example, to do a grant through Emory, it makes that process a little more seamless.
And I found the consulting really valuable. It's a really nice balance with the direct clinical work too. And it's interesting. It keeps you thinking about other aspects of things. And I'll often get a lot of inquiries from families who are in other places of the world or places in the country where they just want to know, they want to pick your brain and know, like, what do you think about what their child is receiving? Is it the best thing? Or are there things to do different? Or can you do some teaching and training with their local team? It's really interesting. It's often interesting type of work. I'll say with some of and it's, again, sometimes it's like, where do these things come from? Like, people just like find you. I think there's just like not a lot of people who do this kind of work, and it's like your inbox just fills up, your voicemail just fills up. And usually there is what I found that's really nice about this private practice and consulting work too, is you really get to pick, like, what do you feel like resonates best with what you're interested in and that works with your life. So things like balancing kids, I have 2 kids. I like to take long stretches off over the summers or the times when they're off for school breaks, and you can kind of line things up that work with what you're doing at those different points in your year and your family life. I'll say some of the consulting. Go ahead, Celine.
Oh, I was just, because someone was asking financially, and how you mentioned, Cynthia, about it's so transparent. For those of you who aren't aware, it's now the law that if you're in private practice, you have to put your fee schedule on your website. It has to be made public. So you could go to my website, naxatl.com, and see my entire breakdown. Um, and so that's nice. Like it's also nice to know, because I can go on other clinicians' websites. Like, am I charging in the ballpark of my colleagues? Am I overcharging? Am I undercharging? Not to mention that you can just refer people directly to your website. My whole fee schedule is there, my consulting rate, my IEP rate, my whatever, it just makes it so transparent, which it's coming from academia when everyone's like hush hush about money and you don't talk about your salaries and you don't compare yourself to other people, especially, gender differences and disparities and all that. It's just so refreshing that that's all kind of out in the open.
Uh, so thinking about growing from, if you start in solo practice, when does it make sense to expand to a group practice? I would say from myself as well as colleagues, when I started, I didn't start in with the idea of I wanted to make a group practice. I started in with the idea of I have this caseload of patients, people who have strong relationships, have been making a lot of progress, and they don't want to move to another clinician. So I want to keep doing solo practice to serve the needs of these families and serve the needs of these kids. And then things kind of just slowly built out from there, and started to see that, my gosh, the demand is really high and I'm turning a lot of people away. I don't want to start lengthy wait lists. I'm running out of people to refer these families to. So I've always kind of taken the mode of like, well, if you get up to the point where there's a problem and a need and you can't figure out where to go from it, then maybe just try to solve it yourself. And so try to see like, well, what are some of the options that you could do? Do you want to do these other things? Do you have that? And I had people reaching out to me saying, can I join your practice? Can I do this? I found that I kept saying no to things that I was like, why am I saying no to this? Like, maybe let me just think about it. And so then I thought about it. I was like, well, yeah, that actually isn't that hard. This wouldn't be that difficult there. Maybe, yeah, let's just do this. So I mentioned that just to say that you don't have to, I don't feel like you always need to know exactly what your final plan is when you start, and that you really can evolve as other things evolve with you, and decide, what do you want to do at that point? What makes sense then? How do you want to run things? How do you want to build? And I think in general, if you start thinking, I think some people stay completely solo practice for forever, and that works perfectly well for them, and they really like that. So I think in private practice, you have that ability to stay completely solo. When you get to the point where you start thinking about growth is when you have a number of consistent referrals where there's a lot of overflow. One of the things I find that I say very differently now as when I first came into the field is, I remember when I was started at CADB and we really wanted to try to take things as like, we're going to do 12 sessions. We're going to do 12 sessions, and then, we're going to refer the family to something else. And I just kept finding it was so hard to do only 12 sessions. And it was so hard to know where to send them after that. And so as much as I've wanted to try to help people in a shorter period of time, the further and further I've gone in this work, the more and more I've found that there's always something to be working on. And it is often therapy for a lot of kids with neurodevelopmental disorders like autism. It is often a very long road. And so even if they discontinue therapy for a certain period of time, they're often coming back, or they're going from a one-on-one service to a more group-based service, and there's a number of different things happening. So I've kind of stopped the idea of thinking that I'll see kids and families for short-term therapy, and have let them stay as long as we're continuing to make meaningful progress and have really clear targeted goals and are working on things in a science and research informed way. So with that just means that openings for therapy spots don't happen very frequently. And so when they do happen, it tends to be a little bit, there's only one or two spots here or there, and then there's long stretches in between. So I don't think it's very helpful to keep really long, lengthy treatment wait lists. So I think if you're starting to get a lot of requests for therapy and you don't have space opening up soon, then it's really, you want to start thinking about, if you don't have referrals, how can you grow? How can you build your practice to hire other clinicians to help provide some of those services? Then I think the other thing, when you're developing and you're building, you can look at your business structure in a couple different ways. So, in terms of revenue models, with having clinicians who are working for your practice, you can have W 2 structures, you can have 1099 contractor structures. Some of that is going to vary depending on the state that you're in and also the scope of what you're hiring those people to do. You can also have more flat fee rentals where you're sharing operating space, you're sharing overhead, but you're running your own separate business entities. And then you can also think about some type of hybrid structure within that. What changes when you're going from more of a solo practice into more of a group practice is you are expanding, then again, from being more of just a primary clinician to now you are going to have more leadership and administrative responsibilities, which initially was one of the things that was really kind of nice about just being in solo practice. So you do want to think about at what point are you ready to take on a little bit more of that, because there is, when you're running a group practice, even if you're running more from like a 1099 contractor model with the other therapists and clinicians who are joining your practice, you are going to have a higher degree of administrative responsibilities associated with that. You'll likely need to also hire some level of admin support, somebody to help with billing, scheduling, the general day-to-day patient flow. You do also then, you would need to have various systems set up. You would have to have a payroll structure. You would have supervision again. So if you're taking on trainees, you're of course going to have to provide supervision for them, as well as junior level employees, especially if you're hiring them as W-2 employees as opposed to 1099 contractors who are going to be much more independent. So you will have some increase in your overhead expenses when you move from a solo to a group practice, but you also have the opportunity for much greater reward. There's going to be higher impact, increased scalability in your practice, and of course, increased revenue streams that'll be coming in. The other thing that you want to think about, though, when you're going from a solo practice into more of a group practice is also, what are you trying to build and what's the culture that you want to build there? Because I do think that it can be challenging when you're bringing in multiple different personalities, people who might have different types of approaches. And so I think you really want to be mindful and really think about not losing what your initial intention was when you went into private practice. Right. So Lynn, for the leap.
All right. I think I talked a lot about this in my own journey, that I got to that breaking point, which was what was my, kind of push to do that transition. But everyone is different. I've actually mentored postdocs who went into private practice right out of grad school and right out of their training. And that, to me, I got overwhelmed for them, but they weren't overwhelmed. I think what was different is that it was financially more of a struggle at those earlier stages in their career, unless they actually had the finances. But taking out loans, for example, to set up their practice, which a lot of people do. But also growing your network and knowing how to make those connections. So for example, I've learned in 8 years what's worth my money for advertising and what's not. Like, of course, I threw everything into Google ads, and can NACS be at the top when people do a search for autism assessments? And that ended up being not worth anything of my investment. But Psychology Today, everyone goes to Psychology Today looking for stuff. So I get so many referrals through them. My own website. So paying for my own website to me is worth it because that comes in that way. And then just getting to know my community practitioners. They are my number one referral. So I go to the Georgia Psychological Association's conference every year and I give a CE workshop for their continuing ed, right, for training, and I network and I meet all of them. Like, oh, you're the one who does psychoed, you do schizophrenia, you do, and really establish those connections because they end up being your biggest referral source. I know that we're coming to the end here and people are asking some great questions.
Yeah, we have about 5 minutes. Oh my God, this is such good information though. So I don't want to interrupt you, but just so you know, we have about 5 minutes.
Oh, okay. Um, but someone's asking, when both Cynthia and I are private pay, what does that say for our caseload? As far as diversity, I personally, I'm in Atlanta. I get a wide diversity in my clientele. I do specialize in older school age children, adolescents, and adults, especially females, because nobody in the community does that. Um, and because I'm private pay, I am getting, people from who have more means. That's not to say that I don't work with anyone in disadvantaged communities. I have, and I've set up payment plans, and there are a whole bunch of different ways. Some people do sliding scale, some people just do pro bono. There are options for doing that. And, you know, we have the benefit of being able to say like what I do for one family, it's on my own basis, right? That I might do a sliding scale for one, I might like it's completely free for another. It's really depends on the family that comes to me. But that said, uh, also there are ways to get involved in the community doing things outside of the private practice, like I'm going to go do these assessments, for the school district or whatever, and that ends up being how I'm contributing in that way. I don't know if you wanted to add to that, Cynthia.
Yeah, no, I would say similarly. I keep a set on my caseload that are all reduced fee of reduced fees. They're not full fees, and I work with families for maximizing their out of network reimbursement. So that's where a lot of network gap exemptions come in. And then I'm in process of getting approved with DOE to take DOE vouchers for some of the neuropsych assessments, because in this is something that's specific to New York City, but New York City will pay when a parent requests an IEE, an independent education evaluation. New York City has increased the amount that they'll pay for those evaluations, so that has allowed a lot of private providers to actually accept those vouchers now, because they do cover quite a bit of their time, and they will let you take 4 of those a year. So I'm working on that, and so between that reduced fee, working with out of network benefits, and then another thing I'll do is if I have a family who they're not going to be able to stay with me long term because of the financial constraints, then I'm usually looking at having them send, okay, who are their in-network providers? Because maybe, I'm thinking of a young man who I recently started seeing who does not have any out-of-network benefits. And so we want to identify who is somebody in-network that could be really strong and that he could transfer to, but there's going to be a wait. They're going to likely be an LMSW. They wouldn't be able to do the evaluation part, but I have that part mapped out. I have a good sense of him. I can do training and consultation to that other provider we identify, and then move him over to then, and then I can take more of a step back and provide more of a consultative role as he's navigating through. So there's just a lot of flexibility in terms of how you can figure out those things. The other thing is I'm taking on trainees, which allows to also have a number of lower fee options for families, where with trainees, if a family is seeing a predoctoral graduate student, you can charge very minimal for those therapy and assessment services, and really to just cover your time to provide the supervision over those cases. And so that's another way to help with accessibility for families. But so I would say I see a pretty wide range of the SES spectrum, but I am in the middle of Manhattan. So that also, the majority of families in this like geographical area in general are a higher net income population, and it is the norm in this area to not take insurance if you are in mental health, which was something that was shocking to me when I moved from Chicago to New York back in was like 2012. It was when Cadby was being developed. And one of the things that was going to be unique there is they were going to take insurance. And I'm sure Steve can tell you how that went, and how much money they did not make by taking insurance as in the mental health sphere. But it's just very, very difficult to have something that can stay, that can meet all of the operating costs and salaries and be in network, particularly with like Medicaid insurers and things. But so just all to say that the area where I'm practicing, it is very much the norm to not be in network with insurance, which that might not be the case in everywhere else in the US.
I'm afraid I'm going to have to interrupt. We're past our time. Um, by the way, thank you that you're making us all really jealous, just so you know. But I also, the whole purpose of IDEA is just to present these ideas, no pun intended. But if there's enough interest, there's many spin-off groups from IDEA that are operating independently now, like a full workshop on this if people are interested. If you just submit to the IDEA listserv that this might be something you're interested in, we can build a group and actually pay you guys to consult and do a workshop or something. I think there's a lot of interest and a lot of questions on, the details of how this happens. Like Cynthia, oh my God, you just spouted so much crap about insurance that it scares me. Like I don't know about that stuff. I mean, I have people here who do insurance, so I'd have to learn all that stuff. So there are these learning curves, I think that we're all a little bit maybe afraid of, but we would dive into. But just to be able to have that impact and that flexibility would be huge. So I do have to sign off because we have other stuff going on because it's after 11 at nighttime. But oh my God, thank you guys so much. I'm so happy that you guys have improved your quality of life and you're still making such a great impact to the families and the patients out there. So thank you, everybody. If you guys are interested, next month we have Steve Scheinkopf coming. He's a researcher from here at the Thompson Center and was at Brown before that doing research on early cry data with babies, which was really fascinating. So feel free to again jump in next month. Otherwise, we'll see you guys in a month. All right. Thanks, Lynn. Thanks, Cynthia.
Thank
Everybody.
you so much. Thanks, Cynthia. Bye.